a wee sign coming up saying that recording started. Okay, so that's the recording underway now. So formally, can I say welcome to the second in a series of 3 professional learning events framed around the theme of building links with families and how to reach and involve and engage with families that we have traditionally struggled or found harder to build these relationships and to have that engagement. As I mentioned, this is the second session in a series of 3 sessions that can be taken as standalone events or a series of 3. In the final session will be on the 23rd of March, and information about that will be coming out tomorrow, and the link for that meeting will follow on Monday of next week. So the link will be available as of Monday of next week. So these conversations are a different approach for us to professional learning, but not a new approach to professional learning. We're building on a model that we've seen used elsewhere. They're meant to be informal, they aren't meant to be conversational, and they really are for you to get involved. And your involvement can come in a variety of ways. If you want to come on camera and to raise a point or ask a question or make an observation, then could you use the raise hand function? And somebody will see that, and David will bring you into the conversation. You also have the option to use the chat function, and I really encourage you to do that. The chat's a great way not only of having communication between the speakers and the audience, but within the audience itself. So I do encourage you to use the chat function as well. And my final observation is that I hope that this conversation and the availability of a recording and the fact that some of you attending have been able to bring a +1 will let these conversations be the embers that spark further conversations, whether that be in a school or with another partner or whether it be within an SDS team. So that's enough from me. I'll just be going off camera in a moment or two, but my final comment, and you'll seen it in the text in the chat as well, is if you're not making an active contribution, can you stay off camera and keep your mics muted, and that avoids any intrusive background noise or feedback becoming problematic. Okay, David, I think enough from me. I'll pass over to yourself and let you do the introductions.
Okay, thanks very much, Ken. We made the absolutely fatal mistake of having a really fabulous conversation for the first one, and that honestly is never a good idea. So we've given ourselves a bit of something to follow up on. But I think what's been really encouraging about the first conversation was the way that you engaged with it as an audience, or at least the people who were here for that first conversation from SDS engaged with it. And that was really exciting for us because it showed a real level of commitment, a real level of engagement and interest as well. And it made the whole thing just flow. So we were hugely encouraged by that level of interest that was there. And that, I think, made the event as much as the speakers, although again, we were really privileged with the speakers that we had. And Chris Kilkenny in particular made a significant impact on people, just talking about his own experience and what it feels like to be a dad, with lots of very challenging circumstances, but also what it feels like to be Chris Kilkenny, which in my experience, as well as Chris's, has always been pretty challenging. And people responded really well to that. But we got great insights from Pauline Scott from Tigers, who really showed how much she knew and understood the world that we worked in, and also brought so much from her own experience. And we got excellent information from Homestart, some really fascinating challenges about how much we engage and whether or not we draw on all of the sources of information that might be helpful to us. So that gave us, I think, a really good springboard for this conversation. And again, this conversation is different because what we're doing today is we brought along people who, in a sense, are experts, who are coming at it from a different perspective. They've all got experience, obviously, but they've also got knowledge and perspective, and that's what we're bringing today. We're going to start off with Tristram Huli, who will be well known to some of you. And if not, the blurb that we sent out in advance gives you a really good idea of what Tristram's pedigree is. Why I'm really excited about having Tristram on is because of the real commitment and ongoing commitment that he's got to social justice and equity. And also the fact that he knows and understands SDS and how it works. He's done quite a bit of work, and I think is doing some work just now with SDS, and I'm absolutely delighted with that. I remember my first meeting with the first time I was working with SDS, and I went into a room to meet with Tristram and somebody else, and I was really, really impressed with him. I was really impressed with his clarity. I was really impressed with his commitment, and I really felt utterly inadequate and realised just how much I needed to learn if I was going to be able to make any kind of sense of the work that was taken on. But I chose just to bluff it. So I learned a lot from that, and I'm sure I'll learn more today because I'm now passing on to Tristram Huli.
Great. Well, thank you for having me into these conversations. I think I remember our first meeting a little bit differently. I think I remember you telling us off, keeping you waiting. But we've been kind of now known each other for quite a few years, and over that period, I've seen Skills Development Scotland go on quite a journey, really, and I've kind of dipped in and out of it over the years, trying to understand where you are. And I think it's really exciting that this set of professional learning that you're doing, where you're really thinking deeply about how can we support these hard to reach learners. And we're probably going to kind of play around with that idea of hard to reach. And I know in last week's conversation, people were kind of saying, well, you know, is that the right term? I suppose it's a question about is it those people who are hard to reach, or is it you who are hard to reach? And this is the kind of stuff that I think we need to think about a bit. So I'm going to start off by just kind of hopefully giving you sort of three ideas that kind of come to me when I've been trying to think about some of these issues, and particularly about the issue of family as being an important part of what we do in careers work. So I mean, I suppose the first thing I should say is when I'm talking about career guidance, what I think you're calling now CIAG, I always get a bit confused with all the different acronyms that float around in this area. So, but what I'm talking about is broad. So yes, it's the one-to-one work, and of course it's got to also be careers education that happens in schools and in classrooms, but it might also be experiential learning that people are doing. It might be quite subtle stuff that people are doing in the community that's not always come and sit down in my office. You know, it might be conversations that people are having in a whole variety of different ways. But anything we do to help people to develop and think about their career and to manage it across their lifetime, you know, I'm happy. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in anything we can do to do that. And I think I'm pretty open to the wide range of ways that we can do that. And we're going to touch on that a bit as we go through. So the first idea that I've got really is that we've got to move away from the idea that a career is an individual thing, that it's just something that one person does. Because I think when we think about, if we've often talk about careers as being relevant and the focus being individuals, and that's driven a lot of our approaches to practice. And of course, careers are something that individuals do. We do make decisions, you know, something that is quite personal to us and so on. But of course, a career can't just be something that we do individually, and it can't just be something that we work on in the context of someone's kind of mind or thinking. You know, we can't just say, you know, dream whatever you want to dream and you can make it true. That's nonsense. We all know that. We have to engage with the context, the circumstance, and so on. So when we're thinking about people's careers, we're thinking about what they want, what they think, but we're also thinking about the people that they interact with, the people around them, the relationships they have, and we're also thinking about the organisations and institutions that they engage with. And that's why when we did the work on career management skills, you know, we use this idea of networks as being a kind of key part of what you're doing when you're doing careers work. You're not just working with the individual, You're working with the individual in context. You're working with the individual in relationship to their personal relationships, but you're also working with the individual as they interact with institutions, so the workplace, the school, and so on. And what this makes me think, and increasingly I've sort of had this idea, is that means we have to be a bit more assertive as careers professionals in thinking about how we work with those relationships, those families, those communities, and those institutions that people are in. So we can't just be, you know, closeted away with a student or a client in a interview room and do all of our work there. So there's a really interesting report that was done probably coming on for 10 years ago now by a European group, which basically brought together all the people who are involved in training careers professionals. They called it the NICE network, which was you know, a bit of a funny name, but there you go. But one of the things they said was, you know, they said, well, if we're deciding what careers professionals need to be able to do, they need to be able to, you know, be counsellors, be educators. But one of the things they said is they need to be what they called social systems interveners, which is a nice bit of Euro jargon, but I think is really, you know, is what we're talking, is that you have to be able to play into systems. You have to be able to try and influence the way that organizations and systems work. If you want to help people in their career, you have to do that. So that's my first idea, is that career is not an individual thing. It's something which is about the relationship between the individual and the collective. It's a relationship between the individual and their relationships. It's a relationship between the individual and the organizations and institutions they interact with. Right, the second thing is that I think the research is absolutely clear. When you go out to, when you look at the research, and a lot of it's based on surveys and things, you go out to people and say, who do you listen to in your career? Sadly, the top answer to that question is never careers advisors. And, you know, it isn't even teachers who young people spend more time with. The top answer is almost always my family and friends. My parents, my co-workers, my friends, and so on. So the second sort of point I want to make is that families matter and parents matter. Now, that doesn't mean that every bit of advice that a parent gives to a child about what they should do with their career is absolute solid gold, brilliant advice. Of course it isn't. There's lots of issues, but what it does mean is that people listen to their parents. And so there's like a fair few ways in which we might think about this. So there's a theory that's often used, you might have come across before, which is Godbrandson's theory of circumscription and compromise. And what she says is the way in which people develop their career ideas is they gradually have ideas that they had kind of limited. And that sounds bad. I mean, that sounds like we're saying, you know, it's, you know, you're closing down possibilities for people, but that's not really what it means. What it means is that inevitably we can't all do everything. So as we move through life, we gradually close some doors where we think perhaps that's not for me. I'm probably not going to be a basketball player. I'm not, you know, I'm not over 6 foot. And so parents are one of the key people who are involved in that process of circumscribing what people might do, of closing doors. So if you come home from school and you say, look, I'm thinking of doing an apprenticeship, and your parents say, oh no, apprenticeship's a waste of time, you don't want to do that, then obviously you don't, you know, you kind of, well, it's going to be much less likely that you're going to pursue that. Parents have influence, and they have influence for the better and for the worst. And there's various other theories that help us think about that. So one is the idea about parents helping young people to set their kind of horizons. Where do you think you're going to go? What do you think you're going to do? And you know, generally, I think most parents are pretty ambitious for their children. I mean, there's been research that's shown even some of the most, you know, people who are born into kind of most poor backgrounds, their parents still would like their children to go to university. So generally, parents have quite high aspirations. They often don't know how to achieve that. They don't know what to do with that. But parents are helping to set young people's horizons. Where might they be looking? What might be possible? And the other thing is that this draws on another set of theories which talk about capital, which I think Phil's probably going to talk about a bit later on. But parents transmit certain things to young people which either help or hinder them in their careers. So one is, money, straightforward. If your family's got a lot of financial capital, a lot of money, then it's helpful to you in your career. Of course it is. But there are other things. So Bourdieu, the social theorist, he says, well, there are other things that kind of do the same thing as money. So if you've got a really brilliant network, if your father's a lawyer, he knows lots of lawyers, he can connect you up. So parents have this other kinds of capital, this social capital, and then I think what we're going to touch on later is this idea of cultural capital, the idea that parents they transmit to young people how to act, how to behave, what's appropriate behaviour in different circumstances, and so on. And so, depending on what your background is, you know how to get on in some environments better than others. You know what sort of things to talk about, and so on. So my second idea is that parents matter. And the third idea is that parents and families are a resource for careers professionals. And so, I think sometimes the reaction to that second point, when you talk about, well, what's parents' influence over young people's careers, sometimes the response to that is generally to view that as a negative thing. So parents limit you, they mute your aspirations, they stand in the way. And I think that's a very unhelpful way for us to think about it, really. And we need to try and turn that around. I mean, I've been into lots and lots of schools where the teachers and careers professionals and so on want to spend the first bit of time telling me, well, kids, these kids, it's really difficult working with these kids because, their parents are holding them back. Their parents are telling them shouldn't, go to university or do an apprenticeship or whatever. So I think that's not a very helpful way to think about it, which is not to say that, every parent is brilliant and every parent is giving every child the best help and advice they can get. But it doesn't really take you very far, because if you end up in a conflict with parents, ultimately, as we've just said, you're likely to lose that, because parents have more influence generally than a careers advisor does, or than a teacher even does, over a young person. Often, not always. So I think it's much more helpful to view parents and families as a resource, and we then need to think about, well, what do we do if we want to help parents to be a better resource? So the first thing is we have to try and engage with parents, and that comes back to my first point, that we can't just work with the individual. We have to recognise the individual is in a system. They're in a family system, they're in a relationship with their parents. Those things matter. And if we don't engage with those relationships, and if we don't talk about those relationships, then we end up at loggerheads with the parent, and that's ends up being very difficult. And there's quite a lot of research that tells us that where schools and parents are in tune, where they basically endorse the same things, young people tend to do better. Where the school and the parents are constantly in disagreement, that tends to not be a good outcome for the young person. So what we're trying to do is think, well, how can we bring the parent on? How can we involve the parent? How can we make use of the resources that the parents have? Well, there's lots of things that we can do, and we hopefully will talk about some of them throughout the session today. But one of the things we can do is we can involve parents. We can validate the career choices they have, and they have made. Get them to talk about their careers. Many people who are in this kind of hard to reach category might feel that their job and their career is not worthy of being talked about. And I think we should be absolutely trying to say, no, it is worthy of talk about. You might have struggled, you might have spent periods unemployed, you might have a job that's not the best job in the world, it might not be everything you want, but you've still managed this, you've still thought about it, you've still ended up in a position where you are putting food on the table, or you're struggling to put food on the table. And giving young people access to a full range of careers when we talk about careers with them, rather than just constantly talking about kind of white collar or decent work kind of careers, I think is really important. So when we talk about careers, we talk about the labour market, young people should recognise the experiences they see around them as being choices that they might make. And they should also have the opportunity, when we're doing employer engagement and when we're hearing from working people, which is a really important part of careers provision, they should have the opportunity to hear from a really wide range of working people, not just people who've kind of sorted everything out and kind of, you know, either the people who've been advantaged and just gone through without any difficulty, or equally the people who've had the kind of rags to riches, overcoming all their problems, because both of those things are kind of unrealistic for most people. Most people don't have either of those stories. So we want to involve families, we want to involve parents, we want to validate the kinds of experiences that parents have and the careers they have, and have these things be recognizable. But we might actually go further, and I'll just finish with this thought, which is a kind of, I suppose, an intervention that I saw. So this has come from one of my PhD students, Anne-Marie Oomen, who worked in the Netherlands. And so she kind of had run across many of these same issues that we're going to be talking about today and that you were talking about last week. And one of the things that they were interested in doing at that point, probably the policy has changed a bit now, but at that point they were interested in engaging working class kids in going to university. That was one of the aspirations they had at that time. And one of the obstacles they found to that was that kids who were from working class backgrounds, their parents had no experience of higher education. And although they might be positive overall about the idea of their young person going to higher education, they didn't know what course to choose, they didn't know what process to go through. There was lots of obstacles that sat in their way. So what Anne-Marie did was she set up what she called twilight sessions. So at the end of the school day, before the kids really go home, but sort of parents could perhaps knock off work a little bit early and get to the school. And she set up these workshops where she would do some pretty basic stuff, which would just be to explain, to bring parents in with their children. They talk about careers, they talk about what things they were interested in, and they would also then learn a bit about, you know, how does, you know, in our context, it'd be like the UCAS system works. How does that work? Well, you know, what form do you have to fill in and what date do you have to do it by? But then give them some labour market information as well. So, you know, there's lots of things that we know that often people who don't have this kind of cultural capital, don't know how the system works, think it's going to be a really great opportunity. So, for example, people aren't always aware that doing a law degree doesn't necessarily qualify you to be a lawyer, for example. So they provide them with some information. You know, these are what these courses lead to. These are some of the outcomes of them. You know, here's how the courses work. Here's how the processes work. This is what a university is like, that kind of thing. And in that, they would also create conversations between the young person and their children, and also, between the parent and their children, and also between different parents. And what she found was that this session, which what sort of started off as just information giving, kind of mutated into being a family learning environment, where not just the young person was learning about their career, but the parent was learning firstly about how to help the child. And she called it building parental efficacy. So building your capacity as a parent to support your child. And that's one thing that was going on. But the other thing was there's family learning going on. There was learning by the parent going on. Sometimes the parents were also thinking about their own career as well, because not all of them had brilliant careers, and they were all people were thinking, oh, what can I do with this? And then the other thing was going on was they were making connections between different parents. So there was community learning going on as well. And so this is just kind of one example of the kinds of things I'm talking about. So to kind of just finish up there, what I'm saying is we need to deal with people in the systems and in the families and the communities they're in. We shouldn't be trying to divorce them from it. We should be trying to work with those systems, which doesn't, and working with is not always agreeing with everything. Sometimes it means challenging and you know, coming into conflict even sometimes, but we have to work with those situations. Second thing is we have to recognise that parents and families matter. We can't ignore them. And the third thing is that we can use and should use parents and families as a resource rather than viewing them as an obstacle to career development. So I mean, that's I suppose the basic point I'm trying to make. Now, I recognise in practice some of these things are very much more difficult than they are to talk about in theory, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a framework for thinking about this, and I'll be interested in where people want to take this for the rest of the session. Thanks.
I mean, Tristram, you've done an astonishing job in terms of setting up. So there's a real sense of momentum. Before we do, sorry, I dropped for a moment. Before we do move on, can I just ask you, from that wider perspective that you have,
Sorry, I'm losing you, David.
I think he has dropped off.
Right, sorry, apologies to everyone. So many of the things that you've talked about have implications for the role, and one of the things that's coming up in the chat is the lack of access that careers advisors suddenly have. Sorry, that careers advisors often have. Is there something we need to think about the whole idea of the role of the career professional in order to deliver that kind of vision of what I think you're talking about is careers advice in context?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of direction of travel on this is quite clear, really. Is that pretty much everywhere that the idea of the sort of modern careers professional is not just an advice and guidance like actor, really. They're hopefully doing more than that. That's not to diminish advice and guidance. It's a really important part of it. Clearly, some people will need to specialise in that. But I think when we're thinking about how we train careers professionals, when we're thinking about how we might construct those roles in the future, we want people who can do a range of things, and working with one-to-one sort of situations is a really important part of it. Working in groups and in curriculum is another really important part of it. We also want people who are, can produce information, can, write stuff for the web, these kinds of things as well that are part of the situation. But this idea of intervening into communities, working with families, intervening in institutions, feeding back, I think is all part of it, really. Oh, very good. So I think we've got lots of reasons why we might want to think about how we develop the careers professional, the kind of concept of the careers professional as we move forward. That hopefully increases and builds on the professionalism rather than diminishing it, which I know was what people are often worried about.
No, and I think there is an awful lot of echoes there of the kind of conversation that was coming up last week. Not last week, but in the first conversation about how careers advisors career professionals were judged, how they were assessed, the kind of data that was looked at. So lots in there, I think, that we'll come back to. But if I may, let's move on to Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk. Always a real privilege to work with Suzanne, which I do often. In terms of communication, generally, I mean, Suzanne is simply awesome. She has an incredible ability to reach out to people, and the progress that's been made in terms of building a national network around adverse childhood experience and the awareness of trauma, all of that remarkable groundswell that Suzanne's been part of really underscores her ability to engage and to communicate. But what Suzanne also brings, I think, to this conversation is a real understanding of what makes people the people they are, and maybe some of the things that we need to think about when we do engage with parents and families, particularly in difficult circumstances. Or you may decide to talk about something else, Suzanne. It's your opportunity now. I'd just like to hand over to you.
David, thank you. Tristram, Phil, everybody who's here, it is a delight to be here. And I thought that I would talk about two things. I really want to talk about curiosity and the importance for careers advisors, for systems, for all of us to have more curiosity about what is going on for other people. Because very often the problem that people has is not one that might have occurred to us and that therefore we haven't helped with, and therefore we make things worse. But I also wanted to weave in with that the idea of something that I have only now made up the name of as a result of what Tristram was saying. If we are about to talk about cultural capital, when we hear from Phil, I want to talk about what I've just named emotional capital. And then we can start to see in a deeper way what parents bring to their children, what they might struggle with, what they bring to a system, what they might struggle with, and what their problem might be. So let me start with a story. I am by training a developmental psychologist. That means that I understand that I have studied a lot about how babies develop, why relationships are important, and how relationships shape their brain and their bodies. And I did that for about 20 years. And about 10 years ago now, I stepped away from that full time in order to try to translate the science that I loved to the wider public. And so I have spent 10 years now working with all sorts of groups and organizations and the wider public, just trying to find ways to help them to understand why relationships matter so much to who we are. And as a result, I get lots of queries on Facebook and Twitter and all sorts of things that I would never have thought about otherwise because I wouldn't have had access. So I was thinking about a parent who one evening private messaged me on Facebook and said, "Dear Dr. Zeedyk, please can you help me? I was to go into my child's school today, and I did try. I thought maybe that you could help me to have information to explain to them what happened, because I came to one of your sessions once and you told us about how childhood experiences shape and they stay with you, and you can remain stressed basically by events that were a long time ago. And that's what happened to me today. My child is for the first time in trouble, and I got a letter asking me to come to the head teachers for a meeting at the head teachers. And I went to the school and I got out of the car and I tried to go through the front door and I couldn't. Because I remember when I was in the head teacher's office as a child and I got strapped. It's the first time I would have been to the head teacher's office in my child's school. And I just couldn't walk through the front door. So I got in the car and I drove home. And now my child has come home and is really angry at me because they sat in the head teacher's office alone and I didn't show up. I don't know how to explain to them, and I don't know how to explain to the head teacher. And all I can think about is what you told us about in that session, where bad things that happened to you before can stay with you. Please, can you send me something that might help me to explain to the head teacher? Okay, if we were all in a room together, I might hope that at the moment there would be a still silence across the room as all of you took in the implications of that story. Because it happens all the time. People struggle with things that other people have no idea about, that they then can't tell you about, and often they don't even understand it themselves. What was kind of remarkable about this parent was that they understood what was going on with them, but it was because they had had some science about how childhood events can stay in your body that had really helped them to make sense of it. Effectively, they were still scared of the head teacher because of the old head teacher. The emotional capital that they brought to their child and to the systems that their child needs to be part of was fragile. because stress lived in their body from a long ago time of pain, distress, not being heard, lack of help. Tons of parents face that. So when they come to walk through the door of their child's school, they're carrying with them memories of when they were in school. They're carrying memories, and by memories, they might be conscious memories or they might be unconscious bodily memories of stress and fear and lack of help that prevents them from thinking clearly about how to solve problems, about solutions, about opportunities. And we often never think about this because we think of the past as the past. And we think of, this is the child in front of me now, and we forget about the child that exists in the parent. Okay, I've just tried to tell a story that helps us to see what we might not see, that curiosity could help us with. So whenever people do things that I find inconvenient, that I don't understand, that, to be frank, sometimes piss me off, I try really hard to move into curiosity. Because unless you believe that parents are trying to undermine their own children, then they're doing their best. It's just that the emotional capital that they bring may not be enough to help solve the situation. When you overhear a teacher who's shouting at children, they're probably not helping with their learning. And the emotional capital that they're bringing to the classroom is not great, but they're probably doing the best they can. One question becomes, does the system, does the culture of the school imply that it's okay not to have enough emotional capital that you end up shouting at children? You know, once upon a time, we had a school system that the emotional capital, given that I've just made up this term and I'm now putting it in lots of sentences, that it was okay for adults to strap children who misbehaved or didn't do very well with their maths or brought the wrong shoes. In other words, the way we dealt with problems not that long ago in our past, but in our past now, used a different kind of emotional frame, a different kind of a different expectation about the way that we would respond to children. It's harder to see some of the fragilities of emotional capital in the moment. It's often easier to see them in the past, which is why I think curiosity is really, really valuable. Because I can start to try to think, okay, you're doing your best. This is not great what is happening here, but if you're doing your best, what is happening that I don't know about or that I can't see? Can I imagine something beyond my experience in this moment? Okay, so here is a bit of information that I think helps people and helped that parent. If we understood more about how the stress system functions, we could start to see behavior that's inconvenient as part of the stress system. So Tristram just got delivered a cup of tea by some lovely person who lives in his house. That will have helped to calm his stress system because he's had a drink. It's a warm drink, so that will help him to relax. And he smiled at whoever's brought that cup of tea to him, so he's had a little bit of an oxytocin boost. All of that has helped Tristram's stress system. I don't have that kind of emotional capital because there's no one in my house to bring me a cup of tea. It's a little tiny moment, but it helps us to think about what is going on in Tristram's body. And because Tristram will be calmer, he'll be able to be more in tune with this conversation. All of us a few minutes ago wondered, was David going to come back? Because he had faded away. And Tristram just kept talking, kind of hoping that David was going to show up again, but he didn't really know. So all of us lived with a little moment of uncertainty. Our cortisol levels will have gone up a tiny bit, wondering about the unknown of whether David was going to come back. That's our stress system. And your stress system, how you just cope with ordinary life, whether you do that robustly, smoothly or whether you struggle with that, like walking through the front door of a school, or like dealing with a child who's cheeky, or like speaking to a teacher who you don't like very much of your child, but they're your child's teacher that year. The way that we handle stress and emotional situations is shaped by experiences we had in our earlier in life, especially in our early years where we come to trust other people. So your stress system and your brain is developing really rapidly in the early years. It continues to develop again in adolescence. And I could talk about that at length. And maybe we'll come back to that questions. Here is my real point. Most people don't know how the stress system develops. Most people don't consciously think about how the stress system functions. And so we don't have the opportunity to get curious about what happened to that child in the past that might be making it difficult for them to pay attention in the present. That is adding to why they're getting stressed with me and they're using inappropriate language, or why they're kicking the child's seat in front. All behavior is driven by some sort of underlying emotional physiological state. And if we could get more curious about that, we would be able to assist young people in all sorts of ways. Let me finish with one other thought. Not only can all of you out there as individuals do that, you can just get more curious about young people, about the parents that you work with, about your colleagues, about what they're struggling with. Sometimes that takes a lot of courage because you may be the only one in your school who is doing that. So I remember when I work with nurseries and when staff come to training and I'm basically saying we need to cuddle our children more. If you're the only staff member who now believes that you really should cuddle early years children more, and you go back to a setting that doesn't believe in cuddling children, it's pretty scary to try to talk about that. It's hard to change a culture on your own. So it can take courage to do as an individual. But we also need systems that can be curious. So I want to end with two quick examples and then I'll wind up. One happened today on Twitter and I tweeted about it. So I'm hoping that this makes us uncomfortable. So there are a large number of parents at the moment who are trying to apply for deferral of their 4-year-olds so that they can wait to start formal primary 1 training for a year. But they're having a lot of trouble with local authorities. And there's a lot of conflict out there. So this is today's tweet from that group of parents. We asked a local authority to provide details of their source for data published on a public forum. They told us that it was ADES Scotland, that's the Association of Directors of Education. They told us that ADES Scotland were the source, and we wrote to them, but ADES told us that we couldn't see the reports or the data used by local authorities. Tell us again about transparency, learning together, and GERFIC. You have some angry parents here? These parents don't trust, and they believe that they have reasons to not trust. So the system has created untrusting parents. One particular parent who is very vocal in this group tells the story often of the terrible time she had over deferral with her child. She will never trust the school system again. So although her child was 5 at the time and her child is 10 now, when her child is 15 or 17, she will be carrying the distrust that was created when he was 5. The system created its own problem because it couldn't get curious enough about how to solve some big problems. And I want to then finally wind up by reminding us that we've all been here before. I often talk about a guy named James Robertson who was big in the 1950s, and he was trying to get hospitals to change their policies so that more parents could stay with their children when they were admitted to hospital. And after 2 decades of doing that, he had this statement to say in a 1970 lecture that everybody's forgotten, but that I quote all the time. He concluded that this was our problem, and I think it still is. He said, "The major obstacle to suitable care of children is neither practical difficulty nor lack of knowledge. It is that whatever level of intellectual understanding may have been achieved throughout the professions, the appropriate sense of urgency is missing. In other words, systems have time to change. Systems have time to dilly-dally. Systems have time to sort out possible solutions. But children and families don't have that time. Children and families need our urgent curiosity in ways that the system keeps us sometimes from having. So whatever you can do to be more curious, and whatever you can do to get your system to be more curious, I think is the key thing that hard to reach children, families, and parents need. They need more of our curiosity. I hope that's helpful.
It certainly appears to be from the chat, Suzanne. Lots of really interesting things coming in the chat, lots of it very supportive. Lovely comment that came in. Somebody just simply saying, the past is almost always present. And that absolutely captures so much of what you've been saying. And yet again, a lovely comment coming in from Kathy McPhail, which echoes both what you've been saying and what Tristram was saying. And she says, just shows how important the holistic approach is. Always felt that guidance can't exist in a vacuum. We need to understand what affects our clients' thinking in order to support them in ways that make sense and feels comfortable to them. And again, I think your driver of urgent curiosity has been picked up really well around this. But I think some of the things which we'll come back to, the lovely idea about the whole sense of doing the simple things, you know, the small things that you spoke about, vital when we make contact, and lots of really valuable lessons around that, you know, just offering a drink, doing all of these straightforward things. Consistency across an organisation. Your point from the give them time Twitter feed about making sure that there's consistency. We can't be transparent as the face-to-face link with families if our organisation isn't backing us up with a similar level of transparency. And lots of really excellent points, I think, being made around that from you. So we'll, I'm sure, come back to lots of that, but thanks for that in the meantime. Time to bring in Phil Beadle. Again, as I said about Suzanne, he's someone that I absolutely love working with. Phil's an author, he's a thinker, he's a musician. He's got a number of strings to his bow. He actually needs more arrows. So Phil brings a huge amount, but fundamentally for me in lots of ways, Phil Beadle is a teacher. He's been teaching today. He writes about cultural capital, but he goes out and lives it. He goes and lives with it, he deals with it, and he makes a point of working with those young people who most need the kind of interventions that we're talking about today. And you've had so many trailers into this, Phil, in terms of what you can do and what you know. I'm now going to pass over to you to see where you want to take that.
Okay. I have to say, I'm a school teacher. I'm not in any way qualified to talk about careers. And there'll be elements of this where you have to translate it through your own prism. When I hear this idea of hard to reach families, and David, please turn something down. It's echoing. That hard to reach families, you're basically talking euphemistically about a working class. Now, I've been teaching for 25 years on council estates. I was teaching in one this morning. And what I want to do in this kind of 15-minute ramble is just give you a sense of what it takes to be a transformational agent in the lives of working class kids. And you may have to apply that to the parents. And I also want to give you a kind of indication about the level of perfect storm that you've got in terms of working class engagement with education. Now, there are, of course, distinctions between Scottish working class communities and customs and the ones I'm more used to. Also, equally and very importantly, I don't want to superimpose whiteness on the working class, because Arcala is right when he says that the British state plays race against class. First of all, just want to give you 3 key words for the lesson, because I screwed up my lesson this morning with the key words, and these do come from Pierre Bourdieu. Two of which, panopticon, you will be aware of. A panopticon is a prison system in which the prisoners actually enforce a spy on other prisoners. The second one is an obsequium. Now, the obsequium is a Bourdieuian term about how, quite often within working class communities, if somebody wants to leave that community, then the working class community, and I can see on the chat that this is not everybody's experience, then some members of the working class community will attempt to drag that child or person back down. And the third one is, and I'm not sure whether I've got this right, whether it's antinomy or antimony. There's an ant in it, definitely. An antimony is a swirling state of paradox. And if you are from a working class community, quite often you can be caught in this perfect state of antimony. And the antimony is that everything that is good about this culture, and there is loads good about it, also mitigates against it engaging within educational fields or certain aspirations. Just give you a thought experiment and maybe a piece of homework. So I'm just going to go through all the varying different factors that are likely to affect engagement from this community with what they perceive to be middle class institutions. Just to give you a sense of how awful everything is in terms of things being stacked against them. Next time you go into a newsagent's, have a look around. Now, you might regard, and I certainly did at the age of 14 and 15, the newsagents as an oasis of pleasure. But have a look in it. Every single bloody thing in there is designed to kill you. From the bottles of cheap cider, the cigarettes that are enforced upon that culture, and even down to the newspapers that exist to keep you a specific form of ignorant, even down to the positioning of the sweeties. The positioning of the sweeties are basically at a child's eye level, at a four-year-old's level, and are designed to be so. So they have every single thing stacked against them. And within that community, I think, in order to understand their engagement with careers, you have to understand the relationship between the parents and the children. In that quite often, our fathers and our mothers, despite what society may view of them, are truly great men and women. And our fathers may be truly great men in that they may do 3 jobs to keep the 5 kids eating, and they will sacrifice tobacco in order to buy the kids shoes, and they'll cry quietly at night when they're doing it. And consequently, within working class culture, quite often the father and the mother, and this is not the same in middle class culture, because I now live in a middle class household and don't understand it. The father and mother in working class culture, specifically the father, are absolutely deified. And when you start talking about aspiration, and personally, I think the aspiration thing is bullshit. Aspire to what? When the thing that you have closest, which is an unbelievably hardworking father with an incredible value system, who never ever screws anybody over and gets up at 3 o'clock in the morning to keep the roof over our heads, then you exist in a state of hero worship of this person. And certainly that was the way I was brought up to both of my parents. Now, you have, as a working class person, a certain value system transmitted to you by those parents. And there is often a disconnect between the middle class institution and the working class values. So if you have a look at what's good about this culture, quite often what is good about this culture mitigates against them engaging in a culture which will expressly contradict it. So working class culture, one of the good things is that we are close-knit and protective of each other. Family is very, very important. Our neighbours can be very, very important to us. But that, and this is a very interesting distinction. What happens in the home is care, and what happens in school is learning. And quite often that disconnect can be total. Whereas in middle class households, learning is seen as an intrinsic part of care. In some working class households, that's a disconnect. And you may have heard from parents, look, if he wants to learn, he'll learn, and that's it. There's nothing that I can do. So this disjunction between care and learning is quite important. And if you think about a value system that we're close-knit and protective of each other, well, actually, that mitigates against achievement, and that mitigates against aspirations to leave the community, because that's taboo. And quite often this protection of the community involves protectionism, and that can really deeply limit aspirations, because the working class are broadly a very parochial breed. We're interested in the local, we're interested in things that are immediately around us, and we're interested in satisfying our immediate needs. And that can quite often lead to a kind of semi-blinkered attitude to life. I worked the first 8 years of my career on the Isle of Dogs in a place called Canning Town, the only place I've ever worked where they didn't have a cash point and the pubs closed at 9 o'clock. And I was, on my first day as a teacher, I was told that the kids here have got an island mentality. And I'm thinking, what? You know, some kind of crass little Englander. And it wasn't that. It was much more parochial than that, in that they're saying these kids live a 5 mile ride down the road from the most vibrant multicultural city maybe on the planet, and they had never ever left the Isle of Dogs. So what we start seeing is that the value system and the things that are good actually mitigate against us having aspirations outside of the community. Another thing that's good about working class culture is that we have a rich and historic culture that we're proud of. For instance, you've got your own regional slangs and your own regional dialects, and you love them. Likewise, if I go down the Rubber Dub on a Sunday with my old man, I'll ask him, after I bought a couple of Nelsons at the bar, I'll ask him whether he's got any dosh since he got the tin tack, and I'll ask him how his Noras are, and he'll go, what, my Emmas? And I'll go, yeah, you Clements. In Cockney rhyming slang, we've got 47 different synonyms for hemorrhoids. Now the issue, and it's an incredibly rich cultural heritage. Now the issue with that, in terms, and this applies to black communities as well, and it will apply to Scottish working class, is that no matter how sophisticated our achievements in language, and they can be incredibly sophisticated, that is an area in which the working class have been very successful in at points. Think of the injury. That level of richness in linguistic abilities is never recognized within the school system. So the school system superimposes an exclusively middle-class register. And if we speak within our own dialect form, or if we speak with profanity, which is de rigueur in my community, then we're excluded from schools. Another thing about working class culture is that we're irreverent and humorous. And quite often, again, the value system of the school and the home don't match up. So for instance, when my middle son first came home and said that he'd been hit at school by another boy, and my wife's middle class, I've turned around and gone, smack him in the mouth then. And this is perceived to be a perfectly witty and irreverent piece of humour. If I'm seated around the dinner table in their youth with the boys, and my kids accuse me of talking bollocks, I will reward them for it. But if they do that in a school community, again, they're going to be excluded. So quite often, and here's another thing about the working class sense of humour, that one of the brilliant things about it is there's no respect for the sacred, be it the piety of priests or the alleged intellectual brilliance of teachers or careers advisors. In order to be respected by this community, you have to respect first, and you have to earn it. So what I'm going to do in a little bit is just to give you a little bit further, is to give you an idea of how many different factors mitigate against achievement. So I've been writing a book about it for about the last 13 years. And the contents page now of the barriers to working class engagement, it's now 3 pages long, because those barriers are so manifold. One, you've got structural issues. Any system which is in any way selective is going to reject them. The continued existence of faith schools. Most of kids from working class, many children from white working class communities will be atheists, so the faith schools will reject them. There's this antipathy between the middle class institution and the value system and the value system of the home. So, for instance, in many homes, corporal punishment still exists. I'm sure it's corporal and not capital. Whereas violence is anathema to the middle class institution. And there's also the middle class institution does not acknowledge that there is an antipathy between the two value systems. So how are they going to broker any difference between them if neither side really properly acknowledges it exists? And Suzanne was talking about emotional difficulties of people going back to school when they've had only deeply negative experiences. And historically, people have had incredibly negative experiences of school. The third one is attachment to the ghetto. That we like where we live, we're proud of where we live. And there's another thing about working class value systems, it is almost taboo to leave your mum and dad. Now, if you are careers advisors and you're trying to raise aspirations and get kids to look at the whole wide world, then you're actually, to an extent, assaulting the value system of the people that they most deify. Lack of parental involvement now, which is, I suppose this is what it's about. There's manifold reasons for that, but I saw on the chat, and I recognize this as a teacher, that the people you most want to see, you never get to see. So if I have students that are not properly engaging, that are not properly respecting learning, they'll generally be of the same community. And they'll also be of the community, maybe, who have to look after younger kids during parents' evening, whose dads are doing 3 shifts. And so consequently, it can be very, very difficult to access them. The only school that I've ever seen it work in was in the council estate in Downham, which is a predominantly white working class council estate, where what they did was they appointed a community liaison officer from the community. Somebody, one of the mums, spoke just like the community, knew the cultural mores of the community, and it was only through having that outreach officer that they managed to get more cultural more involvement from mums and dads. Next one, impact of economic status. If you are always skint and with the current Tory rentier system, trying to afford rent in this town it's absurd. You have to go without food. If you are always skint, then that is what you are concerned about. Planning for your kids' future, which everybody knows that education is a nice thing to have, but sometimes planning for your kids' future is as of nothing compared to ensure they've got some food in their stomach. There are also the alienating factors of the continued denigration of white working class culture. So the continued denigration of working class culture in the media, everything is propaganda. The continued denigration of white working class as racist, which, and this is this is a difficult area, because while I have a great deal of respect for Black Lives Matter, and a great deal of disrespect for people arguing against it, because the obverse of it, of course, is Black Lives Don't Matter. But the school community needs to be, and this may be a London thing, needs to be very, very careful that in talking about the suffering of minority ethnic communities and the inequities and vileness of slavery, that they're not actually blaming working class people for it, because it wasn't us that did it. It was David Cameron's antecedents. The alienating factor of the continual denigration of white working class culture by the nanny state. Now, we live with a slightly more libertarian government nowadays, but broadly, if you are being continually told that everything in your culture is wrong, if you've got, what's that fat tongue bloke? The cook, Jamie Oliver. If Jamie Oliver is calling people white trash on the basis that they use ready meals, then that's going to cause a reaction. Okay, and if you've only got mini Kievs and oven chips, and if that's your luxury, and a packet of Rothmans, and you're being continually told that that is wrong and it's going to be stolen away from you, then again that's going to cause a reaction against engagement. There's also a thing about the construction of adult masculinity, in that when we're kids, the most contact that we have with our fathers quite often is through wrestling and play fighting. And working class labor, manual labor, is about selling the only thing the working class male has got, which is the labor of his body. And so consequently, boys are told to toughen up. They're told that they're not able to cry. And we grow up within a hegemonic masculinity that fears books. Books are perceived, I don't know whether you know this, books are perceived to be a sign of effeminacy. They're within my family, I'm still regarded as being unacceptably effeminate. And one of my relatives at a funeral recently said, "What are you doing for a living at the moment, Phil?" And I said, "Well, I write books and talk bollocks." And he said, that "You forgot something in there, mate. You forgot something there." And I said, "What's that, Lee?" He goes, "It's total bollocks." So it's perceived, with book learning is perceived to be, to a certain extent, witchcraft in certain elements of the working class community. We're told to develop a hegemonic version of masculinity, and every single bloody thing we see on the telly and from Hollywood valorizes a certain form of masculinity that specializes in being brilliant at violence. There's also the construction of adult femininity. Adult femininity within working class communities comes vastly too soon. Now, I see in Mufti Day at school, I see females of the age of 12 and 13 walking in tracksuits with the word juicy on their bums. And there's also, this is important, the absence of appropriate role models. And I'm going to ask you a question. Could you think of somebody, and maybe it's probably more likely you'd be able to do so in Scotland. Could you think of somebody who is not a musician, an actor, or an athlete in any way, who is a decent and appropriate role model for, say, for instance, for white working class kids? And you might say Billy Connolly, and I would applaud you to do that. For that, you might say some form of political figure. But the fascinating thing is how short that list is until somebody says, what is the correct answer? Well, my dad, or my uncle, or my granddad. And that is where we get our role models from. We get our role models from the community. And with those communities, it's about bringing those role models in and paying explicit respect to dads who've got good jobs in the trades, or your granddad who got a good job in the trade. And we're going to lack of aspiration. I read on the Guardian website years ago when I was constructing a speech on this, the lack of aspire to what? Lack of aspiration is bullshit, really. You can only aspire to what you can see. And if you come up from a generation of people where your dads have worked in the trades, where there are no books, well, then that's what you're going to do. Unless you have a brilliantly talented careers advisor who is expert at communicating belief. And I'll just finish off with the last two. The work ethic and the family unit are the great things about working class communities, but there has been a dismal erosion of both of those things, possibly, probably, definitely, to an extent caused by Thatcherism. And there has also been a collapse in involvement with the political process. In the old days, your dad or your uncle might have been a shop steward, 1 hour, all out. There is a working class intellectual tradition of libraries and engagement with classic text, which no longer exists. And there's a further and final issue. So I'm just giving you a holistic sense of how difficult it can be to engage these communities. Is that, and I've said this before, that our language is not appreciated and not respected. And quite often, I remember when I first started teaching that, quite rightly, I was told that kids' language is very important to them. and that where I have kind of EAL learners, I must pay explicit respect to their home language. And I thought, right, I get that. And then about the second week in school, a white working class kid swears and he gets excluded. So I think it's, you know, he's just speaking his own language. So I think with working with these kids, it's a very important thing that you have a holistic idea of how difficult it is for them and how difficult it is to engage. And perhaps what you're asking them to do or to consider is against the very value system that goes through them like a stick of rock. And the solutions are, have I got time to just do 2 minutes of solutions, David?
Sure, please.
The solutions are individual. Like living underneath a Tory government, that they're not going to do anything for us. The solutions are individual. One is about communicating belief and becoming expert at communicating that belief and believing that any child can achieve any outcome. Now, of course, as careers advisors, you're going to have to temper that with realism. But I've got various mantras as a teacher, one of which is taken from some American self-help idiot, which is our belief about what is possible controls the outcomes that we get. If you've got kids coming from communities where they probably receive, or they may receive more censure to words, more words of censure to words of praise, and they may have school systems which actually communicate a lack of belief. It's about our individual responsibility to not communicate limiting beliefs. It's about understanding that the expectation of the adult in the room is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's about becoming expert in a language of praise so that you can open up the kid to suggestion. Because negative feedback, which we all need, is very spiky to incorporate. And once you praise somebody, they're much more likely to receive developmental feedback, shall we say. A very, very important thing, and I'll finish on this. I was doing a project in a place called Biggin Hill, in a school predominantly white working class boys, and I interviewed them all about what it takes for a teacher to be a transformational agent in their lives. And there was one phrase that I just thought was just perfect. So what's the difference between a teacher that does really well with you and a teacher that doesn't? And this boy just said, well, a teacher that does well with us approves of us. And if you're to work with young people from challenging background, you have to approve of them. And you have to become expert in communicating how much you like them. And you have to, like a transformational teacher is always, always, always pleased to see you. I hope that wasn't too much of an incoherent ramble.
I love it. I love it. You're the only person I listen to these days that makes me feel like I'm a calm person. So I love that, just sheer intensity of that onslaught of anger, and lots of stuff coming in the chat yet again, you know, supporting all of that. The last point you made, I think, is a really important one, because that's the difficulty, isn't it? Is that how we show the approval and how we open up the possibility. And it's that balance around these two things. Phil and I have got a mutual friend, a guy called Hal Roberts, and Hal talks about teaching in Barnsley. And one of the things that he says very straightforwardly is that he used the book Kes, which many people will know either from the book or the film, which is a celebration of working class life and working class culture, because that reinforced the approval of Barnsley and who these people were, because they could see their nan in the film and her hair was still the same now as it was when the film was made and all of that. And then he used To Kill a Mockingbird because he wanted to open up and challenge some of the ideas that they had around racism and stereotyping. And it's that quest all the time for balance. But what's coming through in the chat, which is superb, is this idea of people really wanting to have the engagement that allows them to develop that capacity to both challenge and support and approve. And if we've done nothing else apart from opening that up, I think that's been a worthwhile day. I'm going to give you, first of all, Tristram, the chance to come back in if there's anything you want to come back in on from the kind of subsequent contributions to yours.
Yeah, I mean, so much here. I'm not going to really try and respond to it all, but I suppose what it strikes me is that you've got some choices to make when you're working. I mean, this is true with anyone. It's not specific to any particular community, but you've got a choice to make about how much you kind of go with the grain and how much you go against the grain. And clearly, a skilled professional does a bit of both, right? A skilled professional is not just, doing going exactly with what a student already thinks. They're trying to develop them, they're trying to move them on. They're not going always just whatever the parents say goes. They're doing a mix of support and challenge. But I suppose, I suppose what I was trying to argue is that the most effective way is to recognise that young people that you're working with are embedded in a culture and a system and a family, and to view those as positive things which you can work with and develop, just as you can work with and develop the individual. Now, that's not to say that you should go in and try and change people and try and change the way everyone thinks, but to try and find the positive, try and work with the groups and the background and the culture and the families that people are in. I suppose that's where I'm coming from. And I think the flip side of that, and it picks up very much on what Phil's saying, which is, I think one of the dangers is that when you go into a hard to reach community, they see you as essentially someone coming from the state to take their children away. Now, that might be in the very straightforward sense of the kind of family policies and so on. But in a bigger sense, lots of things like the widening participation agenda that we had for years in higher education, where it was all about going into working class communities, finding those few genius kids and then pulling them out and taking them off to Oxford or Edinburgh or whatever. And I think we should be a bit sceptical and certainly be careful and certainly see why people might have problems with that. Which is not to say that if there's a kid there who wants to go to Oxford, great, support them to go to Oxford or whatever. But I think if you try and understand where the community are coming from, if you try and understand where their family are coming from, the idea that what you're giving that child is to take away all of the things that them and their family currently value and think are useful, and to split up those relationships and move them into another domain. You can call it the middle class domain or whatever. I think that's a bit of a problem. So I think what I'm trying to say is work with families, understand where they're coming from, and understand where some of the things that you might be doing with individuals, both because that's what the individual wants and because often policy makers push us in these various directions, might be in conflict with these, and be careful not to just denigrate those families' perspectives. I mean, I think what Phil did really nicely was was kind of show the difficulties and the dichotomies, and so I think we have to see the positive. We have to work with the positive. So that would be my sense: is work with the systems, work with the positive, see where that takes you.
Suzanne.
Following on from what Tristram is saying there, and combining that with my call for curiosity, I talked about being curious about children and about parents and systems that are curious, but we could also get much more curious about ourselves. So if I again try to say things that are edgy, because I like saying edgy things, pushing us to uncomfortable places, and given that we're talking about class, I meet lots of middle class parents who are very loving of their children who are 3 or 2 in nurseries, who want to know how they're doing with their mark making. How close are they to doing their letters and numbers? And when you say to those parents that actually just playing outside is great for those children, and that's what is the emphasis for a nursery, that makes many middle class parents, professional middle class parents, nervous because their value system is in getting on with the writing and the maths. So, and we have a system that can easily be constructed around that. I mean, our children go to school at 4, and by school I mean, we see it in a formal sense. Okay, the bottom line is that undermines their development. Being forced to start formal schooling at 4 isn't good for children. Why is our system struggling to take that on board? We're moving in Scotland a lot more toward outdoor play, but we still start formal schooling at 4, and the Upstart campaign, which is trying to have a kindergarten stage, isn't making as much headway as it would like. So what I'm really trying to say with all of that is that if we can get curious about our own value systems, and of course in a class culture, the middle class often assumes that that's the best way to operate. What Phil and Tristan, what I hear you saying is that that when those values dominate, we don't get curious enough about what the behaviors and values are in other classes. And I'm just trying to push us to think that that everything that the professional middle classes think isn't always good for children either. And if we can get brave enough to be curious about those things, then we actually serve children and we serve parents and we serve society in the ways that I think most people set out to do. But it can take a lot of courage to reflect on some of the things that you might not have seen. Is that helpful, David, for me to have pushed us to discomfort in that way?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I'm going to do now is just take a pause. If anyone who's been participating in the session, other than the panelists or presenters, wants to come in with anything, there's lots of really interesting stuff in the chat, but it's not so much questions. It's more, yeah, that's right, you guys are getting it right. But if anybody wants to come in at this stage, I'll take a pause just for a minute or so to give you the opportunity to do that. Okay, nature abhors of silence, and I certainly do. We're very close to 5 o'clock anyway, and I honestly think that there's a fantastic springboard here for a conversation. And if we were doing this live rather than online, we wouldn't get out the room for a very long time for the conversations that would follow on from this one. So on that basis, huge thanks to Tristram, to Suzanne, and to Phil for stimulating that. For me, there's been a huge number of things that have come out of that session that we really do need to keep thinking about and pick up on. And one of the things I loved that came through initially in my thinking from Tristram's contribution was something that had come up in the first of these conversations. And that's what I've begun to think of as the context map. And if Suzanne can invent emotional capital on the spur of the moment, I can invent the context map. That understanding of where people are, who relates to them. And that sits with one of the things that's come through so well in the conversations on the chat around finding the ambassador, finding the representative. And one of the other things which has come through incredibly strongly is stop looking for role models, start looking for examples. And then young people can choose which examples they might want to make role models. And that seemed to me to be a really powerful idea that came through. Don't look for role models, look for examples, because we do the latter too often. And we need to give dignity to all work. And Phil made that point blindingly clear with this whole concept of how hard people work. I mean, Chris Kilkenny's been referenced in the chat again today. I mean, I remember times when Chris Kilkenny was holding down 2 or 3 jobs. He was cleaning aeroplanes, he was working with a railroad gang, he was doing deliveries all at the same time just to keep his kid going. And we don't talk about that We don't hold that up. You would struggle to find that in my world of work. But that idea of us requiring to bring dignity to all the contexts in which young people live, in order that they can have that sense of approval. And fascinating, it's come through a lot from the chat about positive aspects. You know, one of the things that's happened with the pandemic, we've gone out to clap for carers, but we've also clapped for delivery drivers. And suddenly, key workers, the key workers that are still getting into schools, work for Deliveroo, or they work for Amazon, or they work for somebody along these lines. They're not all clapping and celebrating the lawyers, the doctors, or whatever else. So there's an opportunity to turn and build on that. And in terms of practice, people have been picking up strongly on some of the changes in practice that have taken place during the pandemic and how we need to maintain them and build on that. 2 or 3 people saying they've never been more engaged with parents than they've been during this period because of the way they've had to engage with them. So lots there that we really need to pick up on and build up on. Also a sense, I think, in 2 ways that we need help to do our job better. And one of the ways that we need help is from the organisations that we work, schools in particular. You know, the more we can do to encourage schools to use the Raising Attainment money to look at family support workers, rather than an investment in additional maths books or whatever, the more that will help, because that allows us to get into communities and to empower people, and emphasises the link with the third sector as well. And that came up in the first session. I love one of the points that Tristram made. You didn't put it in these terms, Tristram, but it's my translation of what you said, is that the key sign of professionalism is the willingness and capacity to exercise judgment. The true professional doesn't do it by the book. They know the book well enough to go beyond it. And I think that comes through very strongly from SDS colleagues on the chat, that desire to go beyond what they know, to draw on their own experience. And I think an awful lot in that. And brilliant points, I think, about finding the foundation, meeting people where they are, and making sure that SDS thinks about how we build our structures, expectations, and evaluation in order that we encourage the practice that we're discussing today. So I think there are some issues for the organisation as well as there are for the individuals on the call. And Suzanne's exhortation all the time, let's never ask questions of others unless we are prepared to ask questions of ourselves. And let's engage with curiosity around ourselves, because if we don't pick up and explore the issues that we deal with implicitly, then we're not going to put ourselves into a position where we can accept others. And I think that message has been fabulous for me. And what I'm left with at the end of this conversation is 3 things. The first is a set of key words that came from it. And for me, the key words from today have been trust, respect, curiosity. And the last word doesn't quite fit in the same pattern, but it's holistic. It's the idea of working with the totality of the people that we work with, of the context that they work in, and the totality of our own professionalism and the personal resource that we can bring to that. So these words really stuck with me. The other thing which really stuck with me today was the idea that we've done not a bad job in the structure of these conversations, because what we're doing with the next one is we're coming back to voices of success. We're coming back to work with people who've been involved in projects that have succeeded in establishing the kind of relationships with parents that we've been talking about today. And that, for me, will be a really good cap on the conversations we've had up until now. And the last thing, which I think was brilliantly put across by all of you, is that we need to stop thinking in cliches. So much discussion around social mobility, for example, something that I've written about a bit. But social mobility I described in another context as the asset stripping of communities. That often what social mobility is about is taking the apparent best people out of the communities in which they live and putting them into someone else's. And yet we need to think about all of these concepts of mobility and advancement in building the best. But the idea that social mobility is an unquestionable good is something that we need to come back and challenge. And that sits beautifully with what's come through in the chat, that we need to stop thinking on pathways as if there are right ones and wrong ones. Sometimes the two will connect. And if we've got the curiosity, we've got the courage, we've built the trust, we've built the respect, and we've used judgment within our professionalism, as colleagues have done today, we've got a really good basis for moving forward. So thanks again to Ken, Amber, and other colleagues for organising and supporting this. Thanks to the three of you as presenters. And again, a massive thanks to colleagues from Skills Development Scotland who've come along and contributed silently but hugely effectively in the chat. And I hope that some of you will come back for the next one. We're on a roll. Thanks very much. And bye for now. And if we could just encourage the three presenters and Ken to stay on, and we'll do a wee debrief as people leave the conversation, if that's okay. Thank you.